A sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountains, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons, I love her jewel sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. Defining the national character of the rugged southern land has long remained an elusive and intractable feature of Australian life. Even traditional inhabitants of the country were as diverse, sprawling and complex as any contemporary forebear. The perennial challenge among Australians has long remained, anchoring the country with stable cultural grounding. Donald Horne penned a seminal work in 1968, christening Australia as the Lucky Country, a country whereupon wealth seemed to fall from the sky into the lap of its inheritors, a country rung resoundingly with happy-go-lucky convicts, bushmen and second-rate people, and of which the tides of war and existential threat have remained isolated to distant continents. A recent historical narrative by David Hunt underlines this final point, defining Australia by its endless coastline, a land girt by sea, and resigned from world affairs. Others believe it is not a singular feature or character of the country that is culturally significant, but a storm of prominent values shaped through a history of humble sacrifice. The founding fathers of the Australian federal system took pride in navigating the colonial administration, in severing the 6 colonies of their British dependence, all without a drop of blood. This narrative, however, lacked any theatrical resonance, like the American War of Independence and many other independence movements. Somewhat subversive to democracy, the preferred value. Honour in sacrifice is commemorated in Australia on Anzac Day, a day recognising the storming of the beaches of Gallipoli by Australian and New Zealand Army Corps in the First World War. After all, who could dismiss the sheer perseverance and courage in the face of unwavering gunfire? The event not only had internal resonance, but forged a reputation of the ordinary Australian across even the furthest reaches of the world. A more lasting, a more clearly understood vision has, however, served a prominent impression on the collective imagination of the country. That Australia is not defined by what it is not, the sea, or a smattering of collectively conceived values, but what is contained in its own backyard, the Outback, shrouded in masculine bravado, ruggedness, and an unmistakable longing for bush habitation. The Australian Outback has stood steadfastly through war and cultural revision. The Outback myth, a synonym for the bush, is bound by bushrangers, convicts, bandits, grazers, diggers, and sporting stars. The bush has steeped the country and proved the lasting spirit of Australianness. But to evaluate this fixation is most appropriately to evaluate the landscape of Australian art. Artists, plucking carefully from literature, prose and poetry, have served the primary catalyst for the permanence of a bush culture. The scorn of art critics has long remained vivisecting this culture to render it nothing beyond a provincial and dependent intoxication, yet the Outback myth has endured, while not surviving for any supremely valuable cause. The idea of the bush today is framed through the prism of myth and reality. Australian artists first set to work capturing this spirit in the earliest days of settler colonialism. New South Wales at this time was no more than a distantly removed, ramshackled colony suffering from various privations and disabilities. Peopled by tyrants, criminals and painfully entitled settlers, not until the 5th governor of 1810, Lachlan Macquarie, did the colony first embody a self-sustained life of its own, and the vision of a country was, if not born, at least germinated. The zeitgeist of the time was thoroughly washed with bush romanticism. Surviving paintings are redounded with overpowering sentimentalism and provincialism. Indeed, art forms were deeply moved by the post-industrial imagination that had been transported south by British ships. But such a movement seems born almost from necessity, not contingency, making the hostility to industrial development an inevitability almost. Australia, after all, possessed each hallmark of the seeds of a romantic movement, a surging industrial spirit in metropoles, coupled with a land scattered with, in the mind of a French Enlightenment thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, noble savages, while a term that he never coined was a cruel adaptation of what people referred to as indigenous people. And crucially, this narrative needed a continent washed with the idea of the sublime. Australia breathed the air of romantic sensibility. The migration of free settlers cast the country in the idea of escape and romance. The territory of the nation is no less a vista of the imagination, wrote one scholar reflecting on nationhood in Australia. At some indefinable date in the very earliest days of the colony, the identity of the distant southern lands, known then as New Holland, became inseparable from its boundless lands. The rugged terrain swept and captivated a collective consciousness. As understanding of the interior grew through the 19th century, and remarkable landscapes such as Uluru, the Hawkesbury River, and the Blue Mountains was brought under colonial administration, so the mythology became more of an intoxication. As critics have observed, the early settler colonial bush discourse was less organic as it was a contrived artifice to move, fascinate, and render a clear Australian image. Painting, poetry, and art became the implement for a British Arcadianism, depicting sun-soaked lands possessed of twisting eucalypts, honest and rugged pastoralists, and a provincial innocence. This was clearly, however, fashioned from an imagination within the bounds of the empire and its appetites. Captain Cook's voyages of the 1770s had brought to the mother country a foreign inventory. Britain back home was deeply intrigued, sifting through the botanist Joseph Banks's illustrations of the animals. The expedition's finding was to become a thing touched by the anti-natural. Antipodian animals like kangaroos and wallaroos, affectionately called human-sized jumping mice, or black swans, platypi and wombats, all upended pre-existing taxonomic classifications in Britain. Modern scholars have sought to inveigh against the unchallenged co-option of Anglo-Australians of bush fascination. Not only have Australia's coastal fringes served the homeland for indigenous custodians for tens of thousands of years, but the soils and deserts of the vast interior have framed the very heart of indigeneity. This is a different experience to the colonists, whose survival did not depend on a process of outlasting. Life for the indigenous person is furnished from the punishing terrains of flood, drought, and fire, and what little sustenance is offered by the land. The culture of indigenous Australians is nothing but honest. This honesty is what gives it its allure. The indigenous experience of the outback is brought into existence by its own harsh reality. Only at the arrival of settlers post-1788 are the pangs of a new distinctly European, romantic pastoralism sown into the land. Indigenous Australians, as alluded to earlier, came to fit into this picture as roaming, identityless savages, scratching indiscriminately at the land for the occasional meal, surviving only by the barest of margins. This noble savage archetype had a precedent, however, for all across the British Empire, the distant provinces of Canada and the native tribes of America and across Africa and Asia, British colonists crossed paths with indigenous persons and native inhabitants. In many ways, from the colonial perspective, crossing paths with an indigenous Australian was parallel to the encounter with any other native flora or fauna. Little earnest investigation was made to understand these cultures beyond condescending and thickly racialized scientific studies. While some interaction was observed, it was partially motivated by naturalizing and normalizing the colonial project by assimilating hostile natives into the settlers' world. It was often successful, while to the dread and destruction of so many, it was often not. There are no clear patterns determining where and why trade and interaction sometimes worked. New South Wales's first governor, Arthur Phillip, was at first successful in fraternising with the Indigenous Australians, before things very quickly turned south. Early colonial paintings captured a barren landscape with vast open plains receding into the distance. But here the paradox emerges. For even soaked in a romantic vision of natural purity, the land is decidedly cleared and raised for agriculture, as some spiralling gradation of a corruption brought by indigenous dispossession. This gradation of the landscape becomes a potent symbol of ownership. The conceit of the painter is that even they, in fashioning romantic art, cannot resist too cultivating the land. Such a notion is inculcated that the bush remains comfortably under Anglo-Australian control. A dishonesty emerges in the art, for the land is not truly lived, nor can it be placed into European romanticism. There is neither the same struggle against the nature, nor is this nature untouched. It is not sublime. The contradictions become even starker through the 20th century, when reflecting that the post-colonial population is resigned comfortably to metropolitan Australian, and yet sees its cultural image plumbed by rurality. The artist Henry Lawson is perhaps the greatest expression of bush mythology. The bulletin diaries of the 1880s and 1890s became a theatre for understanding the outback. In an ongoing exchange with his contemporary Banjo Paterson, the two debated contrasting visions of the wilds of Australia. Paterson saw romantic adventure and swagger, while Lawson wrote the land as a gritty and unforgiving teacher, like a mirror held up against the common Australian. At the time, most of the population did live in rural, regional, and semi-regional areas, with Australia's economy heavily reliant on wool and agriculture. Bearing a marginal manufacturing sector and nascent technological industry, Lawson's pessimistic tones carried great emotional heft. Soon his harsh geography and rough overtures would formalise the outback as the bedrock of the Australian self-image. Yet while writing the land as hostile and uninhabitable, by even focusing on the bush as he did was to aid in developing it as the grand Australian thesis, and further breathe air into this myth. Lawson's pessimism gave bush mythology a renewed legitimacy. Lawson, like other artists writing and painting the Australian lands, could hardly have avoided imposing his own narrative and aspirations onto what lay before him. In drawing conclusions as he did, only selective elements of the land emerge in his writing. That is not, however, to dispute the authenticity of his vision. This authenticity is what rendered his writing so charged with spirit, while his polemics themselves powerfully composed. In The Bush Undertaker, published in 1892, we find evidence of how this view of the native land and its peoples is selectively pieced together. The story follows a lonely Anglo-Australian man exhuming the body of a local blackfellow, as he calls it, and carrying with him his skeleton back home. Having collected the remains of the blackfellow, we later learned, named Brummie, the man decides not an indigenous burial is best, but a Christian one, fitted with the furnishings of the Protestant Australian. Truth is given to the knowing Anglo-Australian, not to the indigenous folk, the latter subject to the discretion of the white man's will. To save some face, the lonely old man is represented as a subject of poverty, currying some sympathy from the audience, but it becomes impossible as a contemporary audience to defend the story's plot. While a reflection of his time, Lawson's writings today peddle the perspective of the native inhabitants as an organic element of the land's constitution, a view clearly defined through the terra nullius conception of Australian geography, land belonging to nobody. And in giving weight to this perspective through art, Indigenous people can be summoned at liberty against the fashioned backdrop of battle, honesty and struggle. Often they crop up as subjects of the artist, as tools and implements of a British literary and material romance. As one scholar elucidates, Lawson's writing represents an attitude towards reality, a model for constructing truth, a truth navigated by the compass of his own imagination. Certainly a commanding and vivid imagination, but one saturated with colonial assumptions. Lawson's way of seeing Australia is titanic in its significance, and to reject his prose simply out of the ambivalent nature of its subject matter is folly. It is through his works, and works such as Banjo Paterson, Russell Drysdale, Dorothy McKellar, Tom Roberts, and Frederick McCubbin, that A ruggedness is legitimised, and the bush becomes an axiom theory. Indeed, as it did back then, the hand of artists will continue to shape Australia and its cultural identity. While these theories could not have possibly been spawned without an endogenous, a back and forth relationship between the land and its inhabitants, and the subjective view of the observer, Australia remains from a global perspective, a land of boundless struggle, resilience, and fable, scrambled into the package of colonialism. As history would largely reveal, the colonial program was morally bankrupt. This bush fixation, charged both literally and metaphorically, has spanned the course of the New Holland project, and not merely does it reflect the country's physical landscape, but it also serves the molten heart of what it means to be an Australian. The country's inhabitants continue to search for the central idea of Australia, whether its waters, its peoples, or its bush provides this grounding. Now is not the time to deny this call for the Australian identity, but continue its search through whatever medium that calls.